Hi everyone, my name is Akil. I created a whole separate introduction video specifically so I wouldn't waste a lot of your time at the start of each lesson. So if you haven't seen that, go watch it. Before we start the first lesson, I need to provide a brief overview of the Indian taxation system because I make a lot of references to it in the advice I give in my first two videos. At the end of the video, I'll also cover a few basic terms that I use frequently since this series is aimed at a range of people that includes complete beginners. If you understand our tax system, the advantages and disadvantages of the new regime, the basic deductions available to you as a taxpayer, and commonly used terms like equity, mutual funds, capital gains, and debt, you can skip this video. Scratch that, you should skip this video because you're going to find it super boring. Let me clarify that I'm not a chartered accountant and my advice by no means replaces that of an expert. But I think sometimes for the purposes of these kind of lessons, that can be a good thing because I'm going to focus only on what I think every single person should know about the system and not get bogged down in the details. Okay, so briefly, these are the tax slabs in India. You'll notice there are two columns, and that's because as of this recording, Indians have two regimes they can choose between when they file for their tax returns. If you make less than 2.5 lakhs a year, you pay no tax. If you make more than 2.5 lakhs a year, you pay 5% on the money you make over 2.5 lakhs, up to 5 lakhs. It's important not to just say you pay 5% tax. I've often heard people say things like, it's actually better for me not to make more money because I'll be in a higher tax bracket and end up making less money. While there are some cases where that's true because it can affect taxes on other investments, in most cases, it just means you've misunderstood how incremental taxation works. Very simply, someone who makes 5 lakhs a year still pays no tax on the first 2.5 lakhs, but they pay 5% on the next 2.5 lakhs. So they would pay 12,500 rupees in taxes. If you make anywhere from 5 to 7.5 lakhs, you still pay the same 12,500, but you pay 10 or 20% on the amount you make over 5 lakhs, depending on whether you opt for the new or old regime. Now, I'll leave you to pause here or find this table online and go through the rest. Just remember that at each stage, the tax you pay is only on the amount you make above the minimum on the left. Now, I think the first question you might have is, why would anyone opt for the old regime? It clearly taxes you more, right? Well, that's where deductions come in. Deductions are provided for things the government wants you to do. They make these investments more lucrative by allowing you to subtract them from your income before taxes are calculated on it. Now, the Indian tax system, like the tax system in most countries, can get really complicated if you try to cover all of it. So I'm just going to mention the 6 most common deductions and actually focus on 3 of them. The HRA or 24B, depending on whether you're a renter or a homeowner, ATC, ATCCD, the standard deduction, ATD for medical insurance, and if you donate a lot to charity, ATG. One could argue that the LTA is fairly important as well, but I think you can get by without it. Now, to keep this simple, I'm going to get rid of the standard deduction. You can just think of this as a 50K reduction on your total income, which you will not get if you opt for the new regime. Next, I'm also going to get rid of the ATD deduction and the ATG deduction. Not because those aren't important. If you pay medical insurance out of pocket or donate to recognized charities, you absolutely should ensure you get a receipt and claim those deductions. But unlike the 3 we're going to discuss, they aren't in any way complicated. If you qualify for them, claim them. It's as simple as that. And frankly, there are better videos showing you how to do that. In this lesson, we're just going to evaluate the first 3. The deduction you get from your living situation, ATC, and ATCCD. With this information, you'll be able to decide which tax regime you're going to choose, which will be relevant for lesson 1. Also, for now, I'm going to assume you're a renter, and I'll have another filler video like this one to discuss capital gains taxes and home loan deductions as we get to the higher levels, because those aren't really relevant to building a 25 lakh net worth, which is what we're going to be focusing on in the first 2 videos. So before we get started, get your latest salary slip, and I want you to identify 3 values: your basic, your HRA, and your PF contribution. They will be required in the calculations we're about to do in this video. The first step is to figure out how much of your HRA is exempt from taxes. Now, essentially the way this works is you have to do 3 calculations and take the minimum of them. The first is just your HRA. You can find this in your salary slip. The second is your rent minus 10% of your basic salary plus your dearness allowance, which is going to be zero if you're not in the public sector. The third is 40% of your basic, again plus dearness allowance, probably zero. The 40% will be 50% if you live in Delhi, Mumbai, Chennai, or Kolkata. Now, basically you have to calculate all of those three and take the lowest, and that's your HRA or Section 10 deduction. Honestly, what you're probably going to do and what I do is just enter these values in an HRA calculator and find out what your HRA is. Now that you've got that number, let's move on to ATC and ATCCD deductions. For this, calculate how much money you can save per month and then add your PF to it, which you can find in your salary slip, and it'll be 12% of your basic salary, provided you make more than a certain minimum. I think the minimum is 15,000 a month. Add those two and multiply it by 12. If the total is greater than 1.5 lakhs, your ATC deduction is 1.5 lakhs, since that's the maximum amount you can claim. You can also add another 50K for ATCCD if you're keen on investing in the NPS and can manage to save another roughly 4K or so a month. ATC involves more than just calculating the deduction and applying for it. You actually have to choose the investment you want to make that qualifies for it. In the case of the NPS, which is the only way to qualify for the additional 50K, there's also the question of whether it's even worth it. Personally, I recommend the NPS to people older than 45 who plan to retire in India. But if you're in your 20s or 30s and you're not sure about where you'll end up and the money you're going to put into it would have otherwise ended up in equity, I actually think that might be better. Now, even when you consider the tax saving aspect of the NPS. Now, that's certainly debatable, but a lot of this series is going to go with simplicity and my opinion. Now, once you write down your ATC, remember, PF plus amount you can save times 12, your net taxable income under the old regime will be your income minus your HRA minus the 50K standard deduction minus whatever you can save under ATC. Under the new regime, it's basically just your salary. Let's compare the two, and let's start with the new regime because it's simpler. Go to any income tax calculator. Make sure you select that you're using the new regime by opting for taxation under Section 115B here and enter your salary. Let's call it 10 lakhs a year. That is the tax you pay, 78,000 rupees. Now let's imagine you're someone whose HRA is 68K for the year and you can save another 5K a month and your PF is 1K. So your ATC deduction is 6 times 12, which is 72K. Now add 50K for the standard deduction, giving you a total of 68K plus 72K plus 50K, a total of 1.9 lakhs in deduction. And when you take that same 10 lakhs salary, you get 8.1 lakhs in taxable income. Now we go back to that income tax calculator and we're going to select the old regime by selecting no under Section 115B and add your salary minus deductions, 8.1 lakhs, and see what the net tax is compared to the first amount. Now, I chose those values specifically because your tax is almost the same in both cases, and if that happens to you, you should opt for the new regime because it's just less work. However, you'll notice that with 68K as our HRA and 72K for ATC, you are not anywhere near maxing out these deductions in this particular example. If your PF exceeds 1.5 lakhs a year and you're renting a place in a city, the old regime is always going to be better for you. And saving enough that you're taking advantage of these deductions should be your first priority when you start investing. I'll show you how in the first lesson. Okay, that's it for our tax system. As I mentioned before, I'll have another video on more complicated taxes, but those aren't really relevant for the first two. And I want to keep this kind of information at the absolute minimum until you need it because it's boring. Obviously, there are a ton of other deductions available in India, but if you understand which tax regime is right for you, how deductions work broadly, and a little about the 3 deductions we just discussed, that's more than enough to be getting on with for now. The last thing I want to cover was some basic terms that I'll be using a lot in these lectures. The first one is a share. A share can be thought of as you purchasing a unit of a company. So say a company has 100 shares, each valued at ₹1, giving the company a value of 100 rupees. If the company does really well and based on revenue, analysts believe it's actually worth 200 rupees next year, the share price would rise to 2 rupees since by and large the number of shares stay the same. Now, as you may have probably guessed, if the company does badly and is worth only 50 rupees next year, your share is now worth 50 pice. What I hope is obvious here is that in buying a share, you're essentially making a prediction that the company will do well. If you're wrong, you're going to lose some part of that money. That's the risk. Now, to offset that risk, what you could do is buy shares in many companies. But the problem with that is most of us don't know which companies to buy or have the capital to diversify to that extent. Because the lowest amount of a company you can buy is a share, and if each share costs a few hundred rupees, you may not have enough money to buy all the ones you want, especially if you're trying to buy them in a particular ratio. This is where our second term, mutual funds, come in. A mutual fund allows you to invest in many companies without requiring you to have the capital to invest in shares from each one. Let's take another oversimplified example. Let's say there are 10 companies that each have a share worth 100 rupees. If you want to invest in all of them, you need 1,000 rupees. Now, if you don't have that, what if you could find a mutual fund that has invested in all 10 of these shares in equal proportions? Now you can buy whatever amount of units of that mutual fund as you desire, and even with 100 rupees or 10 rupees, you can actually invest in all 10 companies. This gives you a more diversified portfolio which is less volatile, while not requiring you to have the capital to actually invest in all of those companies. The other advantage is that the ratio of holdings in a real mutual fund is never going to be as simple as 10 companies, 100 rupees each. The corpus of a mutual fund is managed by a fund manager who obviously understands the stock market better than you or I, and you're essentially getting a professional to manage your money and choose the companies in the portfolio and also the ratio of their holdings. Now, what's the trade-off here? Probably the biggest one is that there's a charge levied by the fund house for that management. These vary greatly, but can be usually around 2%. Now, the other downside is that there's usually a hard upper limit on returns. Mutual funds will likely give you anywhere from 5 to 17% returns in India when averaged out over any period longer than 5 years. Now, the advantage is that if you choose a good one, it doesn't really get much lower than that when you hold it for long enough, but it also doesn't get much higher. While most mutual funds I talk about in this course are equity related, I should point out that there are many different kinds of mutual funds. Oh, and equity is a general name I'm using for the share market. Technically, the word just refers to ownership of any kind minus liabilities, but when I use the term in this series, I'm referring to investments in the share market, either directly by buying the share from the company or through mutual funds or any other instrument like ULIPs, which we'll talk about in our first lesson. So that's all I wanted to cover about the share market for this video. If you're a complete beginner and want a more thorough understanding, I'll link a video that provides an explanation on how that works, provided I figure out how to do that linky thing on YouTube. The next terms are fixed and recurring deposits. Fixed deposits are when you put a fixed amount of money with a bank for a fixed period of time and gain a fixed interest. So say 100 rupees a year at 7% interest, and the bank gives you 107 rupees at the end of the period. A recurring deposit is similar, except you deposit a regular sum over a period of time, usually monthly. So instead of 100 rupees all at once, you may deposit 10 rupees a month over 10 months. And at the end of that predefined period, you get the principal, which is the sum of your deposits, plus some interest. The only other term you need to understand to work your way through the first 2 lessons is debt. So in the example I gave earlier of a company that creates 100 shares worth 1 rupee each, what I perhaps should have made clear is that the reason a company would do this is to raise capital. They believe they have a promising idea, and they think that other people will believe that too. People buy into the company if they think it'll succeed. Now, there's another way a company can raise money, and it's kind of the way you or I would raise money if we needed to. They can get a loan. Now, in this series, when I refer to debt, I'll usually be referring to instruments that make their return on the interest paid by companies in paying back those loans. Now, companies are usually a lot more careful about paying back those loans, and the return on those loans is usually a much lower risk and far less volatile than returns on equity. But as you saw with the case of mutual funds, you always pay a price for reduced volatility, for reduced risk. And that is, in general, debt gives a lower return than equity. All right, I think you have all the information you need for us to get started. So let's get to our first lab, where we're going to discuss everything you need to get to an 8 lakh net worth. Thank you.